The municipal courthouse bustled with activity on that rainy Tuesday morning. The wooden benches were filled with people waiting their turn before Judge Eleanor Reynolds, a woman whose reputation for strictness preceded her like a shadow. Her silver-rimmed glasses sat low on her nose as she reviewed the next case file. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Next case," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes that contradicted his imposing figure, called out, "The State versus Thomas Chen. Your Honor, juvenile case number J4872. A skinny boy of 15 shuffled to the defendant's table. His oversized thrift store suit jacket hung from his narrow shoulders, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in desperate need of a trim. He kept his eyes down, focusing on his worn-out sneakers as if they might offer some escape from this nightmare. Behind him sat Mrs. Rivera, the latest in a long line of social workers assigned to his case. She clutched her folder tight against her chest, worry lines deepening around her eyes. This wasn't how she had planned her week to go. "Vandalism at the Westside Community Center," Judge Reynolds read aloud, peering over her glasses at the boy who seemed to shrink further under her gaze. "Breaking and entering. Destruction of property." She placed the papers down with deliberate slowness. "How do you plead, young man?" Before Thomas could speak, a harried public defender rushed to his side. Lisa Patel had been assigned his case just 20 minutes earlier, and her wrinkled blazer and messy bun suggested she'd been having quite the morning already. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she answered firmly, placing a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder. "And if I may, there are some important circumstances the court should consider." Judge Reynolds leaned back in her chair, making it creak in protest. "There always are, Ms. Patel. Proceed." The public defender straightened her posture. "My client didn't break into the community center to vandalize it. He entered through an already broken window, and his only purpose was to use the piano inside." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow, silencing them with a glance. "The piano?" she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Ms. Patel, this court has heard many creative excuses, but this one might take the prize." "It's not an excuse, Your Honor," the lawyer insisted. "Thomas is a gifted pianist. He's been without a home piano since his last foster placement changed, and he's been desperate to practice for an upcoming scholarship audition." The judge's eyes narrowed as she studied the boy more carefully. His hands were indeed long-fingered and slender, but they were currently balled into tight fists, knuckles white with tension. Nothing about his hunched shoulders and downcast eyes suggested a confident performer. "A pianist," Judge Reynolds said flatly. She removed her glasses and placed them on her desk with a soft click. "Mr. Chen, look at me." Thomas raised his head slowly, his dark eyes finally meeting the judge's stern gaze. There was fear there, but also something else. A quiet dignity that gave the judge the briefest moment of pause. "Your Honor," Mrs. Rivera interjected, rising from her seat, "I can confirm that Thomas's previous foster family did have a piano, and his former music teacher has submitted a letter attesting to his ability. It's included in the file." Judge Reynolds flipped through the papers again, finding a handwritten note on school letterhead. She scanned it quickly, her expression unchanged. A letter saying a child showed promise. 2 years ago hardly proves he's some sort of prodigy breaking into buildings to practice concertos," she said dryly. The courtroom grew tense. Everyone could sense the judge's growing impatience. These kinds of juvenile cases typically moved quickly through her courtroom. A stern lecture, community service, maybe probation, and on to the next. But something about this case was slowing the usual rhythm. "Your Honor," Ms. Patel pressed on, "the security footage from that night shows my client sitting at the piano for over 2 hours. He touched nothing else in the building. He wasn't there to cause trouble. The fact remains he was somewhere he shouldn't have been at midnight on a school night," the judge countered. "The community center director is understandably upset about finding a teenager in their building when they opened up in the morning." The prosecutor, a young man eager to make an impression, jumped to his feet. "The state reminds the court that this is the 3rd time the community center has been broken into this month. We need to send a message. I'm well aware." "Mr. Douglas," Judge Reynolds said without looking at him. Thomas fidgeted beside his lawyer, his fingers tapping an invisible melody against his leg, a nervous habit he wasn't even aware of. When he noticed the judge watching this movement, he immediately stopped and shoved his hands into his pockets. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her elbows on her desk. "Young man, your lawyer and social worker are painting quite the picture. A musical genius so dedicated to his craft that he breaks the law just to practice. Is that what you want me to believe?" Thomas swallowed hard. His voice cracked, barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I just needed to play. The audition is next week. An audition so important you risked criminal charges?" The judge's tone was incredulous. "It's for the Westland Arts Academy, Your Honor," Mrs. Rivera explained. "A full scholarship. It could change his life." Judge Reynolds tapped her pen against her desk, creating a rhythm that seemed to unnerve Thomas even more. The courtroom waited in uncomfortable silence for nearly half a minute as she considered. Then, unexpectedly, her face broke into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well then, perhaps we should put these remarkable talents to the test." The shift in her demeanor sent a warning signal through the courtroom. Those who had appeared before Judge Reynolds before recognized the dangerous glint in her eye. "Your Honor?" Ms. Patel questioned cautiously. The judge set down her pen and spread her hands wide in an exaggerated gesture. "If piano playing is our defense today, let's hear it. Let's have a demonstration of this gift." Thomas's eyes widened in alarm. "Here, now," he whispered to his lawyer. "Your Honor," Ms. Patel began to protest. "This is highly irregular." "What's irregular, counselor?" "Is using musical talent as a defense against criminal trespassing." Judge Reynolds cut her off sharply. "I'm simply asking for proof." The prosecutor smirked, clearly enjoying this turn of events. The gallery of waiting defendants and their families shifted in their seats. The tedium of court proceedings suddenly replaced with unexpected drama. The West Side community center happens to have a piano in their performance space that my client allegedly trespassed to use, the judge continued. "I see no reason why we can't have one brought here." "Your Honor." "With all due respect," Mrs. Rivera tried again, "putting a child on display like this is a courtesy I'm extending instead of simply ruling on the facts at hand." Judge Reynolds finished for her. Her tone made it clear the discussion was over. She turned to her bailiff. "Mr. Wilson, please make arrangements. I believe the courthouse has an upright piano in the recreation room downstairs." The bailiff nodded and moved toward the phone at his desk. Thomas stood frozen, his face drained of color. Ms. Patel leaned in close, whispering urgently in his ear, but he seemed beyond hearing her reassurances. Judge Reynolds watched this exchange with cool detachment before addressing the crowded courtroom. "We'll have a 15-minute recess while arrangements are made. Court will resume promptly after." She struck her gavel once, the sharp crack making Thomas flinch. As she rose to retire to her chambers, Judge Reynolds couldn't resist one final comment. She paused, looking directly at Thomas with a challenging stare. "If he plays the piano with even half the talent his advocates claim," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'll kneel right here on this floor." Laughter rippled through the courtroom as she gestured dramatically to the space beside her bench. Even the prosecutor chuckled, shaking his head at the absurdity. "But I suspect," she continued, "we'll find this is just another creative excuse from a young man who needs to learn actions have consequences." With that, she swept from the courtroom, leaving Thomas standing there, trembling slightly as the enormity of what was about to happen washed over him. In the gallery, a maintenance worker who had been fixing a loose railing paused his work. He had watched the whole exchange with growing interest, his weathered face thoughtful. As the courtroom began to clear for the recess, he approached Mrs. Rivera. "That boy really play?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Rivera sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "I've never heard him myself. His previous foster mother mentioned it when his case transferred to me last month. Said he would play for hours when everyone was asleep." The maintenance worker nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "that piano downstairs hasn't been tuned in years. Not since the holiday party last winter." He twisted his worn cap in his hands. Might not be fair making him play a bad instrument. Mrs. Rivera looked at him gratefully. No, it wouldn't be fair at all. As the bailiff returned from making his call, the maintenance worker approached him, speaking too quietly for Thomas to hear. Whatever he said made the bailiff pause, consider, then nod in agreement. Thomas sat at the defense table alone, his lawyer having stepped out to make frantic phone calls. His fingers moved silently across the table's surface, practicing invisible scales and arpeggios, a ritual that had always calmed his nerves before. But today, nothing could quiet the storm of fear inside him. In 15 minutes, he would either find his way to freedom or sink deeper into the system that had controlled his life since he was 7 years old. Everything depended on what would happen when his fingers touched those keys. And somewhere in the courthouse, a piano was being wheeled toward a moment of truth. As the 15-minute recess ticked away, the courthouse hallway buzzed with curious whispers. Regular attendees of Judge Reynolds' courtroom told newcomers that they'd never seen anything like this before. The stern judge was known for her efficiency, not theatrical demonstrations. Thomas sat alone at the defense table, his heart hammering against his ribs. Mrs. Rivera had stepped outside to make a phone call, desperately trying to reach his former music teacher. His lawyer was huddled with the prosecutor, arguing in hushed tones. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to shut out the noise around him. In his mind, he returned to the first time he'd ever touched a piano. He was 7 years old, newly placed in the Walker family home after his grandmother. His last living relative had passed away. The Walkers had a small, upright piano in their living room. Mrs. Walker taught beginner lessons to neighborhood kids for extra money. Thomas remembered how he'd sneak downstairs after everyone had gone to bed. He would press the keys so gently, barely making a sound, figuring out simple melodies he'd heard during the day. One night, Mrs. Walker caught him. Instead of scolding him, she sat beside him on the bench and showed him how to position his fingers properly. "You've got a gift," she told him, her voice soft with wonder as he quickly mimicked her movements. "Most children take weeks to learn what you just picked up in minutes." For the next 3 years, the piano became his voice. Through it, he could express everything he couldn't say with words, his grief, his loneliness, his hope. When the Walkers had to move across the country for work, Thomas was shuffled to another home, then another. Some had keyboards or old pianos. Some had nothing. His most recent placement with the Chen family had been going well. They had formally begun the adoption process, even giving him their family name as a sign of their commitment. But they lived in a small apartment with paper-thin walls. No room for a piano. No way to practice without disturbing everyone. When he discovered the community center's music room with its beautiful grand piano, it felt like finding water in a desert. He'd watch through the windows during community events, memorizing the security guard's routine. After the third time sneaking in to play late at night, he'd grown careless. He didn't notice the new security camera installed after recent break-ins. A hand on his shoulder jolted Thomas from his memories. Mrs. Rivera had returned, her face tense with worry. "Your old teacher is on her way," she whispered, "but she might not make it in time." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise. Court is back in session." The Honorable Judge Eleanor Reynolds presiding. The courtroom filled quickly. Word had spread through the courthouse about the unusual proceedings, drawing curious onlookers from other courtrooms. Thomas noticed more people packed onto the benches than before, their faces eager for the promised spectacle. Judge Reynolds swept back into the room, her black robe billowing behind her. She took her seat and surveyed the crowded gallery with narrowed eyes. "I see news travels fast," she remarked dryly. "Let me remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a concert hall." She shuffled papers on her desk before looking up. "Where are we with the piano situation, Mr. Wilson?" The bailiff cleared his throat. "It's ready, Your Honor, but there's been a slight change of plans." Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "The piano from the recreation room is—" "Well, it's not in the best condition," the bailiff explained. "Our maintenance supervisor, Mr. Reyes, informs me it hasn't been tuned in over a year." "And?" the judge prompted impatiently. "And—" the bailiff hesitated. "The courthouse administrator approved bringing in a proper instrument. A local music store had one delivered a few minutes ago. It's just outside." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Reynolds frowned. "This is highly irregular," she said. "Who authorized this expense?" The maintenance worker from earlier, Mr. Reyes apparently, stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. "No expense, Your Honor. The store owner is my brother-in-law. He was happy to loan it for an hour, free of charge. Said it was good advertising." The judge stared at him for a long moment. "Very well," she finally said. "Bring it in." Two men wheeled in a gleaming upright piano, its polished wood catching the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. They positioned it facing the gallery, just to the side of the judge's bench. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off it. His fingers twitched at his sides. "Mr. Chen," Judge Reynolds addressed him directly, "you now have your instrument. Your defense claims you entered the community center for the sole purpose of playing the piano, due to your extraordinary talent." She didn't bother hiding her skepticism. "The court gives you this opportunity to demonstrate that claim." Thomas rose on shaky legs. His lawyer gave his arm a reassuring squeeze as he passed. The walk to the piano felt endless. Every eye in the courtroom followed his progress across the worn carpet. When he finally reached the bench, he stood frozen, staring at the keys. "We don't have all day, young man," Judge Reynolds prompted. Thomas slowly sat down. The bench was higher than he was used to. He adjusted it carefully, buying time as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. What should he play? He'd been practicing Chopin for his audition, but would the judge appreciate classical music? Would it seem pretentious? Maybe something more familiar would be better? His hands hovered over the keys, trembling visibly. He placed them in his lap instead, drawing a deep breath. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Mrs. Rivera watched with her breath held, fingers crossed inside her jacket pocket. The maintenance worker leaned against the back wall, arms folded across his chest, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And Judge Reynolds watched too, her pen poised over Thomas's file, ready to note his failure and move on with sentencing. Thomas closed his eyes. He thought about the community center piano, how its slightly sticky D key and soft pedal had become familiar friends over the past few weeks. He thought about Mrs. Walker, the first person who believed in him. He thought about the Chens, who wanted to give him a permanent home. Then, without opening his eyes, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune floated through the courtroom, soft as whispered prayers. Thomas started tentatively, his tempo slightly too fast, a clear sign of his nerves. But by the end of the first phrase, something changed. It was as if the room around him faded away. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing steadied. His fingers found their confidence caressing rather than striking the keys. The piece was technically challenging, with its delicate dynamics and precise timing, but Thomas played with the natural intuition of someone who understood the music on a level beyond mere notes on a page. In the gallery, a woman closed her eyes, transported by the beauty. The prosecutor's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. Even the bailiff stood transfixed, his usual professional detachment momentarily forgotten. Judge Reynolds sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. As Thomas moved into the climax of the piece, his body swayed slightly with the crescendo. Here was the section he loved most, the part that felt like stars bursting into life across a dark sky. His fingers danced across the keys with newfound boldness, no longer the hands of a frightened boy, but those of an artist lost in creation. When he reached the final gentle notes, he let them linger in the air, fading into a silence so complete you could hear the building's old heating system humming in the background. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Thomas finally opened his eyes, the spell broken. Reality came rushing back, the courtroom, the charges against him, the judge who held his fate in her hands. He turned slowly on the bench to face her. Judge Reynolds had removed her glasses. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, confusion? Her legendary composure seemed momentarily shaken. "Your Honor," his lawyer broke the silence, rising from her seat. "As you can hear, my client's explanation is valid. His only purpose in the community center was to—" Judge Reynolds held up her hand, cutting off the lawyer mid-sentence. "Mr. Chen," she addressed Thomas directly, "where did you learn to play like that?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected judgment, not curiosity. "I taught myself mostly," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Walker gave me some lessons when I was little. Then I watched videos online, and I practiced whenever I could." "Whenever you could," the judge repeated thoughtfully. She glanced down at the file before her. "Which hasn't been often lately, according to your statement." Thomas nodded. "The Chens, my foster family, they don't have a piano. They work really hard saving up for one, but—" He trailed off, not wanting to sound ungrateful. "So you broke into the community center," Judge Reynolds finished for him. The window was already broken. Thomas corrected softly, then immediately regretted his boldness. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone in. I know that now. The judge tapped her pen against her desk, the steady rhythm filling the silent courtroom. Mr. Douglas, she finally addressed the prosecutor. The state's position? The prosecutor stood, looking slightly uncomfortable. The state maintains that regardless of the reason, breaking and entering is a serious offense. However, he added, glancing at Thomas, given the circumstances and the defendant's obvious talent, perhaps community service would be an appropriate consequence. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly. She looked back at Thomas, who still sat at the piano bench, his future hanging in the balance. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "it seems you have much to tell this court about your situation, and I find myself unexpectedly interested in hearing more." She placed both hands flat on her desk, making a decision. "We'll take a 30-minute recess. Mr. Chen, I'd like to see you, your lawyer, Mrs. Rivera, and Mr. Douglas in my chambers." She paused, then added, "And perhaps you could explain to me exactly what this audition is that's so important you'd risk criminal charges to prepare for it." With that, she struck her gavel and rose from the bench. As she turned to leave, she cast one last glance at the piano, a peculiar expression crossing her face, something that on anyone else might have looked very much like humility. The hallway outside Judge Reynolds' chambers buzzed with whispers. Court staff, who normally hurried past with armloads of files, now found reasons to linger, stealing glances at the closed door. Inside, the air felt thick with tension as Thomas sat perched on the edge of his chair, hands folded tightly in his lap. Judge Reynolds had removed her black robe, revealing a crisp navy suit underneath. Somehow, she looked even more intimidating without the formal garment, as if her authority came not from the symbols of her office but from something deeper within her. "All right," she said, settling behind her desk. "Let's speak plainly." Thomas glanced nervously at his lawyer and Mrs. Rivera, who sat on either side of him. The prosecutor stood awkwardly by the bookshelf, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "That was Debussy you played out there," the judge continued, surprising everyone. "Claire de Lune, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the Impressionist repertoire." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "You know it?" A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of the judge's mouth. "Young man, I may be many things, but musically ignorant isn't one of them." She leaned back in her chair. "My late husband was a music professor at the State University for 30 years. Classical piano was his specialty." The revelation hung in the air, reframing everything that had happened in the courtroom. "Now," Judge Reynolds continued, her tone businesslike once more, "tell me about this audition." Thomas took a deep breath. "It's for Westland Arts Academy. They have a full scholarship program for students who," he hesitated, "who might not otherwise be able to afford to attend." "Westland," the judge mused. "That's quite prestigious. When is this audition?" "Next Monday," Thomas replied. 4 days from now." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And what do you plan to play?" "Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor and the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata," he answered, his voice growing steadier as he talked about music. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly, studying him with new interest. "Ambitious choices. Who's been coaching you?" Thomas looked down at his hands. "No one, really. I watch videos online. Sometimes the music teacher at school lets me use the piano during lunch, but it's not great. That's why He trailed off. "That's why you broke into the community center," the judge finished for him. Mrs. Rivera leaned forward. "Your Honor, if I may, Thomas has been placed with 7 different foster families over the past 8 years. The Chens are the first who've started adoption proceedings. They're good people, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. They live in a small apartment with thin walls, which makes practicing difficult." "And the school piano isn't adequate?" the judge asked. Thomas shook his head. "It's really old. Some of the keys stick, and I can only use it when Ms. Liu has free time to supervise. The community center has a real grand piano. I didn't damage anything, I swear." "I was careful." The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while the court appreciates the boy's talent, the fact remains that he entered a building unlawfully on multiple occasions." "Yes, Mr. Douglas, I'm aware of the charges," Judge Reynolds said dryly. "What I'm trying to determine is the appropriate response." She turned back to Thomas. "How long have you been sneaking into the center?" Thomas hesitated, glancing at his lawyer, who nodded slightly. About 3 weeks, he admitted. Ever since I found out about the scholarship. And how did you get in? There's a window in the back that doesn't lock properly. The first time I just wanted to look at the piano. But then, he paused, remembering. It was so quiet in there. No one to disturb. No one to bother. I could really play, you know. Not just practice, but really play. Something in his voice seemed to resonate with the judge. She tapped her fingers on her desk, thinking. The director of the community center is quite upset, she said finally. Mr. Lewis has filed 3 police reports about break-ins this month. The other break-ins weren't me, Thomas said quickly. I only played the piano. I never took anything or broke anything. The security footage confirms that, the prosecutor acknowledged reluctantly. The previous incidents involved vandalism and theft from the vending machines. Different perpetrators entirely. Judge Reynolds nodded. Well, that's something. She fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. Do you understand the seriousness of what you did, regardless of your intentions? Thomas nodded, unable to hold her gaze. Yes, Your Honor. And what do you think would be an appropriate consequence? The question caught him by surprise. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I don't know. I know I broke the rules. I just didn't know what else to do. For a long moment, the judge said nothing, simply studying the boy before her. Then she turned to Mrs. Rivera. The Chens are his current foster family? They're pursuing adoption? Yes, Your Honor, they've completed most of the requirements. They're good people who genuinely care for Thomas. And they're aware of his musical abilities? They are. They've been saving for a piano, but it's not easy. Mr. Chen drives a delivery truck and Mrs. Chen cleans offices at night. The judge nodded thoughtfully. She scribbled something on a notepad, then looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Douglas, what would you say to a different approach here? Before the prosecutor could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. The bailiff poked his head in. Sorry to disturb you, Judge, but there's someone here who's quite insistent on speaking with you regarding the Chen case. A Ms. Liu from Franklin Middle School. Thomas straightened in his chair. That's my music teacher. Judge Reynolds sighed. This is becoming quite the production. She waved her hand. Send her in. A moment later, a small, energetic woman in her 50s bustled into the chamber. She carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression of fierce determination. Your Honor, thank you for seeing me. I'm Gloria Liu, the music director at Franklin Middle. I came as soon as Mrs. Rivera called. She spotted Thomas and her face softened. Thomas, are you all right? He nodded, relief washing over his features at the sight of a familiar face. Ms. Liu turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I had to come. This boy has extraordinary talent. In 23 years of teaching, I've never encountered a student with his natural ability. So I've heard, Judge Reynolds said, and apparently now seen and heard for myself. Then you understand why I couldn't stay away. When Mrs. Rivera told me what happened, Ms. Liu shook her head. Thomas has been practicing on a substandard instrument, with minimal instruction, yet he plays with the emotional depth of someone 3 times his age. She opened her portfolio and pulled out several sheets of paper. I've brought letters from the State Music Educators Association. They've agreed to sponsor Thomas for the Westland audition. All he needs is a chance. The judge accepted the papers, scanning them quickly. This is quite impressive advocacy, Ms. Liu. He deserves it, the music teacher said firmly. What he doesn't deserve is to be punished for seeking out the tools he needs to nurture his gift. Judge Reynolds set the papers down and looked at each person in the room one by one. Her expression gave nothing away. I appreciate everyone's input, she said finally, but I need to consider how to balance the legitimate concerns of the community center with what's clearly a unique situation. She stood up. We'll reconvene in the courtroom in 10 minutes. I'll deliver my decision then. As they filed out of her chambers, Thomas hung back, gathering his courage. Your Honor, he said quietly. Judge Reynolds looked up from her notes. Yes, Mr. Chen? I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, not just for breaking in, but for earlier, in the courtroom. I know you didn't expect me to really be able to play. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Yes, well, life is full of surprises, isn't it? She studied him for a moment longer. That piece you played, it was my husband's favorite. He used to play it on Sunday mornings while I made breakfast. Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. Go on now, she said, her professional demeanor returning. We'll sort this out properly in court. Back in the courtroom, the gallery had grown even more crowded during the recess. Word had spread through the courthouse about the boy who had silenced Judge Reynolds with his playing. New faces packed the benches, including a middle-aged Asian couple who sat nervously in the front row. "Thomas," the woman called out when she saw him. She rushed forward, speaking rapidly in a mix of English and Mandarin. "Are you okay? We came as soon as the social worker called us." "Mrs. Chen, please," the bailiff intervened gently. "You need to stay seated until the judge returns." Thomas gave his foster mother a reassuring nod as she reluctantly returned to her seat beside her husband, who offered an encouraging smile. Ms. Liu had taken a seat behind them and was whispering intently, likely explaining what had transpired. The community center director, Mr. Lewis, had also arrived, his face set in a stern frown as he conferred with the prosecutor. As Thomas returned to the defense table, he felt lighter somehow. Whatever happened next, he had been heard, not just his music but his story. For a boy who had spent most of his life feeling invisible, that itself felt like a victory. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise! Court is now back in session." Judge Reynolds entered, her black robe once again settled on her shoulders, her expression unreadable as she took her place at the bench. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for her decision. "In the case of the state versus Thomas Chen," she began, her voice clear and measured. "This court has heard some unusual testimony and witnessed a rather unprecedented demonstration." She adjusted her glasses and continued. "The question before me is how justice is best served in this matter." She looked directly at Thomas, who stood with his hands clasped tightly before him, waiting to learn his fate. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses, reviewing her notes one final time before speaking. "Mr. Lewis," she addressed the community center director, who stood promptly. "As the representative of the affected property, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this situation." Mr. Lewis, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a carefully pressed suit, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the Westside Community Center serves hundreds of at-risk youth every week. We provide a safe haven, educational opportunities, and enrichment programs to children who might otherwise have nowhere to go after school." He glanced at Thomas before continuing. "Security is paramount for us. Parents trust that their children will be safe in our facility. When someone breaks in, regardless of their intentions, it violates that trust and compromises our mission." Judge Reynolds nodded. "A fair point. And what about the piano specifically? I understand it's quite valuable." "It is," Mr. Lewis confirmed. "It was donated by the Westland Symphony Orchestra 3 years ago. It's worth approximately $30,000. We use it for our community choir, senior music therapy program, and children's music lessons." "And was it damaged in any way during these unauthorized practice sessions?" Mr. Lewis hesitated. "No, Your Honor. In fact, our regular piano tuner commented last week that it seemed to be in excellent condition, better than expected given its age and use." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Better than expected?" "Yes," Mr. Lewis admitted reluctantly. "Apparently, whoever had been playing it was quite skilled and respectful of the instrument." Judge Reynolds made a note. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Please remain available." She turned her attention to the foster parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen?" They stood quickly, nervously gripping each other's hands. "You've begun adoption proceedings for Thomas, correct?" Mr. Chen nodded earnestly. "Yes, Your Honor. Thomas, good boy. Smart boy. We want him be our son for real," Mrs. Chen added, her English more fluent. "We've been fostering for 3 years. Thomas is the first child who truly felt like ours from the beginning. We're saving for piano because we see how much it means to him." "And you were unaware of his nighttime excursions to the community center?" They exchanged a look of genuine surprise. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Our apartment is small. We would have noticed him leaving. He must have gone after we left for night shifts." Thomas looked down guiltily. The judge noticed. "Thomas, is that accurate? You waited until your foster parents were at work?" He nodded without looking up. "Mrs. Chen cleans offices from 11 to 5. Mr. Chen's night deliveries start at midnight. I would wait until they left, then go to the center. I was always home before they returned in the morning." Mrs. Chen pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "You were alone all night?" "All those nights?" The vulnerability in her voice made Thomas finally look up. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I didn't want to worry you. Judge Reynolds watched this exchange thoughtfully. She then turned to Ms. Liu, the music teacher who had arrived so dramatically during the recess. Ms. Liu, you've advocated strongly for Thomas. How long have you known him? The music teacher stood, her posture straight and confident. Thomas transferred to Franklin Middle last year when he moved in with the Chens. I noticed his ability immediately, even though he was shy about it. He would linger after class looking at the piano but never asking to play it. And when did you finally hear him play? Ms. Liu smiled at the memory. It was by accident. I was working late one evening and heard music coming from the classroom. I thought someone had left a recording playing. But when I looked in, there was Thomas completely lost in Beethoven's Für Elise, a piece I'd never taught him. She shook her head in wonder. When he noticed me, he jumped up like he'd been caught stealing. It took weeks to convince him that he was allowed to use the piano during lunch and after school. And you believe he has significant talent? This isn't just a nice hobby? Ms. Liu's expression grew serious. Your Honor, I've taught music for over 2 decades. I've seen children with potential, with aptitude, with good technical skills. Thomas has something different, something rare. He doesn't just play the notes. He understands the music on an intuitive level. With proper training, he could be extraordinary. The judge nodded slowly. She turned next to Mrs. Rivera. As his social worker, what's your perspective on the situation? Mrs. Rivera stood, her case file clutched to her chest. Your Honor, Thomas has been in the system since age 7. His file contains words like withdrawn, quiet, and difficult to connect with. Music is the one constant in his life. The one thing that has followed him from home to home. She flipped through her notes. His academic record is good, no behavioral issues. The Chens are the most stable placement he's had. Their home study is excellent, and they've completed nearly all the requirements for adoption. This incident is completely out of character for Thomas, which speaks to how important music is to him. Judge Reynolds made more notes, her pen scratching quietly in the hushed courtroom. Finally, she set it down and looked directly at Thomas. Young man, please stand. Thomas rose slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. I've heard from everyone except you. So tell me, in your own words, why should I not hold you accountable for breaking into the community center repeatedly over the course of 3 weeks? The bluntness of the question hung in the air. Thomas swallowed hard, searching for the right words. I should be held accountable, he said quietly, surprising everyone. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it. He took a deep breath. But the piano, when I play, it's the only time I feel real. Like I'm not just someone being passed around, someone whose file is full of notes about being difficult to place. When I play, I'm just me. His voice grew steadier as he continued. The audition for Westland isn't just about music. It's about having a future that makes sense, a place where I might belong. I was desperate and I made a bad choice. I'm ready to face the consequences. The sincerity in his voice seemed to reach even the most skeptical faces in the courtroom. Judge Reynolds studied him for a long moment before turning to the prosecutor. Mr. Douglas, the state's final position? The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, the state recognizes that this is an unusual case. While we cannot condone breaking and entering, we acknowledge the mitigating circumstances. We would support a diversion program with community service, provided there are appropriate safeguards to ensure nothing like this happens again. The judge nodded, then addressed the defense lawyer. Ms. Patel? Your Honor, we ask the court to consider a restorative justice approach. Thomas has acknowledged his mistake. He's willing to make amends. His actions, while technically illegal, caused no harm, and one might even argue they contributed positively to the community center by maintaining their piano. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom at this creative argument. Even Judge Reynolds' lips twitched slightly. Thank you all for your input, she said finally. I'm ready to deliver my decision. The courtroom fell silent once more. Thomas remained standing, his fingers unconsciously mimicking piano movements against the side of his leg, a nervous habit that now seemed to carry new meaning to everyone watching. Thomas Chen, Judge Reynolds began, her voice formal but not unkind. This court finds that you did knowingly enter the West Side Community Center without permission on multiple occasions. These actions constituted trespassing, regardless of your intentions or the care you took with the property inside. Thomas nodded, accepting this truth without argument. However, the judge continued, this court also recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to these actions. The law must be applied with wisdom, not merely with rigidity. She adjusted her glasses before continuing. Therefore, I am ordering the following. First, you will complete 40 hours of community service. Thomas nodded again, relieved that jail time wasn't mentioned. This service, Judge Reynolds specified, will be performed at the Westside Community Center, where you will provide piano lessons to children in their after-school program. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Lewis's eyebrows shot up. Second, you will write a formal apology to the Community Center Board of Directors, explaining your actions and what you've learned from this experience. Yes, Your Honor, Thomas said quietly. Third, the judge continued, you will be placed on probation for 6 months, during which time you must maintain your grades and have no further legal infractions. She paused, looking at Mr. Lewis. As for the community center's concerns about security and trust, I believe we can address those as well. The judge reached into a drawer of her bench and pulled out a small key. This is a key to the music room at the county courthouse. It's available every evening until 9 p.m., and the security guard has been instructed to expect you 3 times a week until your audition. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. This was unprecedented. The piano there is a Steinway. My husband used it for community recitals before he passed. It's been sitting untouched for nearly 2 years. I think he would approve of it being used for this purpose. For the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, Thomas smiled. A small, hesitant thing, but genuine. After your audition, Judge Reynolds continued, we will revisit the arrangement. Regardless of the outcome, I expect you to honor the spirit of this ruling by using your talents to give back to your community. She looked at the Chens. I'm also ordering that Thomas receive proper musical assessment and, if recommended, professional lessons. The court will assist in finding scholarships to cover the costs. Mrs. Chen wiped away tears of relief and gratitude. Mr. Chen nodded vigorously, his arm around his wife's shoulders. One final matter, the judge said, her tone becoming almost conversational. Mr. Lewis, would the Community Center Board be amenable to establishing a formal practice space program? There may be other young people in similar situations who need access to instruments they cannot afford. Mr. Lewis, caught off guard, stammered slightly. I would need to discuss it with the board, but it's an interesting idea, Your Honor. I thought so, she said with the faintest hint of a smile. Mrs. Rivera can put you in touch with some potential funding sources from the County Arts Commission. Judge Reynolds picked up her gavel but paused before bringing it down. She looked once more at Thomas, who stood straighter now, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. This court expects regular updates on your progress. Mr. Chen, don't disappoint me. I won't, Your Honor, he promised, his voice clear and steady. Very well. She struck the gavel. Court is adjourned. As people began to rise and talk excitedly, Judge Reynolds called out one last instruction to her bailiff. Mr. Wilson, please ensure that Thomas has my chamber's number. I expect to hear how that audition goes. The bailiff nodded, hiding his surprise at this unusual request from the normally reserved judge. As Thomas turned to embrace his tearful foster parents, Ms. Liu approached with a thick folder of sheet music. We have 4 days to prepare, she said, her eyes gleaming with determination and hope. Let's make them count. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something unfamiliar take root inside him. Not just hope, but possibility. The path ahead was uncertain, but for once it was his to walk. The morning of the audition arrived with a pale winter sun struggling through cloud cover. Thomas had barely slept, his mind racing with melodies, fingerings, and all the advice Ms. Liu had given him during their intensive 4-day preparation. Remember to breathe, she had told him repeatedly. The music needs air, and so do you. The courthouse piano had been everything Judge Reynolds promised and more. Its rich, resonant tone responded to the lightest touch, revealing nuances in the music Thomas hadn't known existed. For 3 hours each evening, he'd practiced until his fingers ached, and the security guard, a kind-faced man named Officer Perez, would gently remind him that it was time to go home. You're gonna knock 'em dead? Kid, Officer Perez had said last night, locking up after Thomas's final practice. My wife and I will be saying a prayer for you tomorrow. Now standing outside the imposing stone building of Westland Arts Academy, Thomas felt every bit the outsider. Students in perfectly pressed uniforms streamed past him, many carrying instrument cases and chatting confidently with parents who looked equally polished. His own clothes, his best button-down shirt and the dress pants Mrs. Chen had hemmed, late into the night suddenly felt inadequate. The Chens stood beside him just as nervous and out of place, but their faces shone with pride. "You ready?" Mr. Chen asked, adjusting Thomas's collar for the third time. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Ms. Liu had wanted to come, but a faculty meeting had made that impossible. "Play from your heart," she'd told him that morning by phone. "Everything else will follow." Mrs. Rivera was there too, clipboard in hand, having taken a personal day to attend. "Remember, whatever happens, this is just one audition," she said gently. "Judge Reynolds' arrangement with the courthouse piano continues regardless of the outcome today." Thomas appreciated her attempt to reduce the pressure, but they all knew what was at stake. A full scholarship to Westland would change everything, not just access to world-class musical education, but a completely different future than the one statistics predicted for kids in the foster system. Inside, they were directed to a waiting area where other scholarship applicants sat with varying degrees of nervousness. A stern woman with a clipboard called out names every 15 minutes. Each time a student would disappear through heavy wooden doors, returning later with either tearful disappointment or cautious optimism. Thomas was scheduled for 11:45 a.m. At 11:30, an unexpected visitor arrived. "Is this where I find Thomas Chen?" a familiar voice asked the receptionist. Thomas looked up in shock. Judge Reynolds stood in the doorway, dressed in casual clothes instead of her judicial robes, but no less commanding for it. "Your Honor," he stammered, jumping to his feet. "What are you doing here?" She approached with a small smile. "Checking on my investment. The taxpayers have provided you with quite a bit of practice time on that courthouse piano." Though her words were teasing, her eyes were kind. The Chens hurried over, bowing slightly in respect. Judge Reynolds shook their hands warmly. "I hope you don't mind my intrusion," she said to Thomas. "I promise I won't stay for the audition itself. That's your moment. But I wanted to give you something first." From her purse, she pulled out a small wooden box worn smooth with age. "These belong to my husband," she explained, opening it to reveal a pair of cufflinks shaped like tiny eighth notes. "He wore them for every performance. I thought they might bring you luck today." Thomas stared at the gift, speechless. "They're probably not cool by teenage standards," Judge Reynolds continued with a self-deprecating smile. "But in the music world, they're a bit of a tradition. Thank you," Thomas finally managed, carefully taking the box. "I've never had cufflinks before." Mrs. Chen stepped forward. "I help you put on," she offered, taking the cufflinks and attaching them to Thomas's shirt with practiced movements. "There. Very handsome." Just then, the clipboard woman called out, "Thomas Chen, the committee is ready for you." The moment had arrived. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Mrs. Rivera gave his shoulder a squeeze. Mr. Chen whispered something in Mandarin that sounded like a blessing. Judge Reynolds stepped back. "Remember," she said quietly, "you've already proven yourself once in the toughest venue imaginable. My courtroom. This should be easy by comparison." That unexpected bit of humor calmed Thomas's nerves slightly. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and followed the assistant through the heavy doors. The audition room was larger than he'd expected, with high ceilings and tall windows. At the center sat a magnificent grand piano, its lid raised to its full height. Behind a long table sat 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all with expressions of polite neutrality. "Thomas Chen?" the woman in the center asked, consulting her notes. "You're auditioning for the Westland Community Scholarship Program?" "Yes, ma'am," he answered, his voice steadier than he felt. "I see you're playing Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor and the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Quite ambitious choices." Thomas nodded, unsure if he was meant to respond. "Very well," she continued. "Whenever you're ready." He approached the piano, adjusting the bench carefully. As he sat, he caught a glimpse of the cufflinks on his wrists. They gleamed softly in the light streaming through the windows, a reminder of unexpected kindness. Placing his hands on the keys, Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of Judge Reynolds' courtroom, of Ms. Liu's belief in him, of the Chens working extra shifts to save for a piano they couldn't yet afford. He thought of Officer Perez and his wife saying a prayer, of Mrs. Rivera taking a personal day to be here. So many people believing in him, when for so long he'd been just another case number in an overloaded system. He began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne filled the room, delicate and questioning at first, then building with growing confidence. Thomas felt the familiar sensation of the world falling away, until there was nothing but himself and the music, a conversation as intimate as prayer. Each phrase told part of his story. The loneliness of being passed from home to home, the moments of kindness from strangers, the fear of hoping for too much, the stubborn persistence of dreams. When he finished the Chopin, he moved directly into Beethoven without pausing, pouring all his remaining emotion into the familiar, haunting melody. His fingers found every note with perfect precision. Yet it wasn't technique that made his playing special. It was the raw humanity behind it. As the final notes faded, Thomas kept his hands on the keys, eyes closed, unwilling to break the spell just yet. When he finally looked up, he saw something he hadn't expected. The committee members were leaning forward, their professional detachment replaced by genuine engagement. The woman in the center had removed her glasses, her eyes bright with what might have been tears. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," she said, her voice warmer than before. That was quite moving. The next few minutes passed in a blur as they asked him questions about his musical background, his practice habits, his goals. Thomas answered honestly, leaving out nothing, not even his courthouse appearances and community service sentence. "Well," the head of the committee said finally, "we normally deliberate on scholarship decisions for several weeks, but I think I speak for all of us when I say that won't be necessary in your case." She exchanged glances with her colleagues, who nodded in agreement. "Thomas Chen, we would be honored to offer you a full scholarship to Westland Arts Academy, beginning next semester." The words took a moment to sink in. Really?" was all he could manage. "Really," she confirmed with a smile. "Talent like yours comes along rarely. It would be our loss not to nurture it." Thomas stood shakily, overcome with emotion. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "We know you won't," she replied. "There will be paperwork, of course, and details to arrange with your family, but consider it settled." When Thomas emerged from the audition room, the waiting area erupted in cheers. Mrs. Chen rushed forward, enveloping him in a tight hug. Mr. Chen kept repeating, "My boy, my boy," with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Mrs. Rivera was already on her phone, sharing the good news with Ms. Liu, and Judge Reynolds stood slightly apart, watching with quiet satisfaction. When the initial excitement calmed, Thomas approached her. "Your Honor," he said formally, holding out the cufflink box. "Thank you for the loan." She pushed the box gently back toward him. "They're not a loan, Thomas. They're a gift. My husband would have wanted another musician to have them, but they're so valuable to you." "Yes," she agreed, "which is why they should go to someone who understands their true worth." She smiled. "Besides, I expect to be invited to your first recital as a Westland student. You can wear them then?" "I will," he promised. "And there's something else I wanted to say." Judge Reynolds waited expectantly. Thomas took a deep breath. "In court that day, you said if I could really play, you'd kneel right there on the floor." He looked down, embarrassed but determined. "I never wanted that. I never wanted to embarrass you. I just wanted a chance." The judge's expression softened. "Oh, Thomas," she said quietly, "don't you understand? In all the ways that matter, I did kneel." She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Sometimes admitting we're wrong is the hardest thing for people in positions of authority to do. You taught me as much that day as I hope I taught you." 6 months later, the Westside Community Center hosted a special concert in their newly renovated music room. The event celebrated both the official adoption of Thomas Chen by the Chen family and the launch of the center's new Open Keys program, which provided supervised practice time on donated instruments for young musicians without access at home. Judge Reynolds sat in the front row, alongside Ms. Liu, Officer Perez and his wife, and Mrs. Rivera. On stage, Thomas performed for a packed audience. Wearing a new suit and the musical note cufflinks, behind him, a small plaque on the wall told the story of a boy who broke in to play a piano, and ended up creating opportunity for countless others. And after his performance, when the standing ovation finally quieted, Thomas announced the evening's final piece. "This is Debussy's Clair de Lune," he said into the microphone, his voice confident now. "It's for Judge Reynolds, who taught me that second chances come in many forms and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply listen." As he played the familiar, dreamlike melody, Judge Reynolds closed her eyes, remembering her husband, the courtroom, and the moment she'd heard music where she'd expected to find only delinquency. In the gentle notes, she heard the power of transformation, how lives could change direction in an instant, how talent could be discovered in unexpected places, how the system could bend without breaking to make room for something extraordinary. And in her own way, without anyone seeing, Judge Eleanor Reynolds knelt once more.